everyone. My name is Maria Thomas, and I work for Allianz Research, the global team of economists, strategists, sector advisors, and foresight experts of the Allianz Group, led by Ludovic Subran. Welcome to Tomorrow, a podcast where we'll be talking about our latest analyses of economic and capital market developments, as well as our views on trends affecting risk management. Let's get started. The future will be powered by metals, but fenced in with iron curtains. In this episode with senior economists Jasmine Groschel and Anu Konathan, head of corporate research, we look at the importance of critical raw materials for the green transition and what the creation of an organization of metal exporting countries could mean for the global economy. Hello, Anu and Jasmine. Welcome to the podcast.
Hello, Maria.
Hi, Maria. Thanks for having us.
So what are critical raw materials?
So critical raw materials are actually minerals that are crucial in the energy transition because of their unique properties and their importance for climate-friendly technologies. So they're needed in the green transformation. So just to give you an example, for example, lithium, nickel, or cobalt are actually essential components for lithium-ion batteries, which are widely used in electric vehicles and also in energy storage systems. Or another example would be platinum group metals that are critical in photovoltaic solar cells or in fuel cells, or rare earth elements, which are actually key components of wind turbines or also electric vehicles. So many countries have actually identified and mapped some of these critical materials, also sometimes strategic materials. So the problem is a bit that the competition for these materials might actually disrupt some of the geopolitics or alliances that currently exist because the production might not be able to hold pace with the increasing demand in these materials because all the countries want to reach their net zero targets. So the market for these critical materials that are actually crucial for the transition to clean energy technologies, this has been grown rapidly over the last couple of years. So, for example, it actually doubled over the last 5 years, and it actually reached about $320 billion US in 2022. So a massive increase. And it actually will increase further. So the International Energy Agency has actually calculated that over the next couple of years, depending on these net zero scenarios that they have, so they have 3 different scenarios, the demand for these materials will actually increase between 2 and 4.4 times, depending on the specific material.
In this context of rising demand, you write that there is a risk of countries creating an OMEC inspired by OPEC. Can you tell us what you mean by this?
So what we mean by this is that we have been living in a world that was very much reliant on fossil fuels. And that's one of the reasons why the OPEC group and the OPEC Plus group were so powerful in terms of controlling the supply and also weighing on prices for fossil fuels. And with the green transition that is ongoing and that should accelerate, as Jasmine just mentioned, there is a risk that we switch from a world that was reliant on fossil fuels to a world that is going to be much reliant on metals. And if we look closer to which countries are producing those critical raw materials, we see that, for example, China is dominating the field in terms of rare earth elements. It also holds 91% of the global market for magnesium, 76% of the silicon metal supply. But it's not only China. Country like, for example, the Democratic Republic of Congo commands over 60% of the cobalt market. South Africa holds a share of 70% of the global platinum. And Russia, for instance, holds 40% of the global supply of palladium. So if those mineral-rich countries decide to form an organization of metal exporting countries, that's why we use the acronym OMEC, they could, form a cartel, manipulate prices, disrupt supply, and also potentially restrain global trade for those products, which will pose risk for countries that are highly dependent on imports. And first of which you have the EU, but also countries like Japan or South Korea.
To close its supply gap, the EU recently proposed a Critical Raw Materials Act. Do you think this will help?
Yeah, so the EU actually gave out these criteria and evaluated basically their situation. This has actually been ongoing for decades, and now they came up with this Critical Raw Materials Act. That was actually potentially meant to raise awareness on the one hand, but also potentially private investments or make companies more aware and try to get them to invest more in these critical materials, in mining, but also potentially in refining materials. So the problem is a bit, as Anno just mentioned, that some of the countries actually hold a very high share of these critical materials. And so giving out potential rules or criteria from where companies should actually source the materials from might be a bit problematic, especially if they might become binding rules, right? So this could actually double the issue that there is already export restrictions of these critical raw material exporter countries. So, for example, there were 45 new export restrictions on critical materials in 2022, and already in the first half of 23, 15 new restrictions by exporting countries on these materials. So this might actually complicate the situation further, that we have the export restrictions and now we have these rules or criteria given out by the EU. So, but let's maybe go back a step and just have a look at what they actually mean, because that's what we actually evaluated. So we looked at the import reliance of the EU in the different materials that they actually evaluated, and they gave out 4 criteria. So, for example, the first criterion was that they gave out the rule that 10% of the EU annual consumption should come from EU extraction. And what we actually found is that 7 of the materials do actually not meet this requirement, including materials such as rare earth elements, manganese, borat, or antimony. The second rule was actually that 40% of EU annual consumption should come from EU processing. And in that, the materials that fall into that category is even higher. So about 21 of the materials do not meet the requirement, including platinum group metals, magnesium, and niobium. The third criterion in this EU Critical Raw Materials Act is that 15% of EU consumption should come from domestic recycling. And there we actually found that 4 materials do actually currently already meet this requirement. 6 materials actually have very good potential to get there, basically. And for other 6 materials, it might be very, very difficult to reach the target because there might be a change in the chemical process or because of the way they're actually built in some of the batteries or some of the products that they're actually used in. And the fourth criterion, the last criterion they actually gave out, is on single country dependence. So, and that is particularly critical because, as Anno just mentioned, some of the countries do have a very, very high share in world exports of these materials. And for the EU, we have actually one material that is highly critical in the mining process, that is borat from Turkey. So most of the borat the EU actually gets from Turkey, and 6 materials in the refining stage. And that includes, for example, lithium from Chile. As Anna just mentioned, Chile is the main exporter for lithium. And for example, from China, we get germanium, rare earth metals, and magnesium. So this is rather critical. And what we actually then did is to evaluate this is we did counterfactual analysis. So we tried to evaluate, so if these rules were actually binding, what would this actually mean for EU countries? And if all of them would be implemented, we calculated that the EU countries would actually have lost nearly 9 billion euros of imports in 2022. So a massive loss if this is binding, and it's not easy to actually shift from what we currently see or what we had in 2022 to actually meeting these criteria and meeting the demand that is potentially to come in the future.
So what can governments do to ensure fair access to these critical raw materials?
So that's a very interesting and tricky questions for policymakers because we do have a challenging geopolitical environment. They have a few levers that they can operate. The first one is that they need to support a favorable trade policy environment so that there are concrete investment in those countries that have the resources and metals. Make sure that long-term investments are made also along with favorable trade policies. And there's also a big concern that needs to be addressed is that the countries that will be reliant on those exporting countries, such as the EU or Asian countries, they need to reduce reliance on single suppliers. I think the energy crisis has served as a lesson for Europe, which was way too reliant on Russia for natural gas, and the continent shouldn't repeat that mistake and make sure that it has a diversified supply chain, so that it's more resilient in case of geopolitical shock or any sort of supply shock. The other thing, and Jasmine also alluded to it when she was talking about recycling, so there definitely should be more investment into recycling capabilities. And there is also some leeway for strengthening domestic production of some metals. You might recall a news over the last few months that, for example, a lithium mine is going to open in France. So clearly there are also some minerals that are available in Europe. But the key challenge is to promote sustainable extraction of those minerals, because we all know that mining is a very, very polluting activity. So there needs to be a strengthening of domestic production with sustainable extraction practices.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Maria.
Thank you, Maria.
Thank you so much for listening. You can find the full report we just spoke about on our website. We'll leave a link in the show notes. If you'd like to discover more of our research, you can also follow the Ludonomics newsletter on LinkedIn. We'll leave a link down below for that too. If you like the podcast, please send it to any of your friends who might like it too, and leave us a rating and a review. We'd love to hear your feedback. In the meantime, stay tuned for the next episode.